Hello, I'm Adrian Finnegan, and this is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, Middle East tension is ratcheting up. Oil markets are bracing for every twist and turn in the conflict. But why are the region's supplies critical to the global economy? And what's next for energy prices? China is ramping up its exports of electric vehicles, but Beijing's drive for global dominance in the market faces roadblocks. So why are nations increasingly imposing tariffs on Chinese EVs? And Thailand wants its people to spend more at local businesses to revive the economy. But will its $14 billion so-called digital wallets work? Geopolitical tensions in the Middle East have historically led to a sharp increase in oil prices. But today, Israel's year-long war on Gaza and its ground offensive in Lebanon have done little to boost prices. That's despite production cuts by major oil producers since October 2022. A wider war in the Middle East that pits Iran against Israel could change that. Missiles are being fired over a region that supplies a third of the world's crude. A dramatic increase in the price of oil could reignite inflation and have serious implications for the global economy. The impact could be felt as far away as Germany and the US, where elections are just around the corner. Dominic Kane reports from Berlin.
This is the Asaluya oil field, one of many across Iran, which collectively produce around 3 million barrels a day, representing a considerable asset for the Iranian government, but also a considerable target for an opponent. Fears of an Israeli attack have grown recently, prompting these drivers in Tehran to form very large queues at petrol stations, fueled by worries over shortages. Although Iran has large proven oil reserves, sanctions and embargoes mean it exports only around a fraction of its daily output. Writ large, the Middle East represents one of the world's most important sources of oil, but also one of the world's greatest potential flashpoints.
The biggest risk at the moment stems from the Middle East, simply because it's a major site of production. A third of world's crude production comes from the Middle East. Half the world's reserves are there. And that means if something happens in the Middle East, obviously the impact on the market is a lot bigger than if something happens in other parts of the world.
Which explains why some markets in the West have appeared jittery in recent days, especially following remarks from US President Joe Biden that his government had been discussing possible Israeli plans to attack Iranian oil fields. He has since rode back from those comments.
The oil price is stable because the world wants a stable oil price. The Chinese are in a recession, and of course they're exerting their influence on both sides and saying, we don't want that. And the Saudis are also very important. They say if there is a bottleneck in oil supply, they will produce more.
And yet, since Hamas attacked Israel last year, the Saudis have been reducing production as part of OPEC's cuts. But these have been offset partially by increased production by non-OPEC countries like the US and Brazil. As a result, the price of oil has dropped, with the cost of a barrel down at least 10%. Broadly speaking, the vast majority of oil supplied to Europe does not come from Middle Eastern sources. But one leading German economist says this does not mean Europe is safe from an oil price shock.
The greater worry which comes economically out of this conflict is that it dampens the mood among business people, and the mood anyway is not the best, at least here in Germany. The business cycle is more or less gloomy.
That sense of gloom is not just in business and industry. Many in wider society feel it too.
For many people, the main fear is inflation. Here in Germany, the headline rate is dropping. The price of a litre of unleaded fuel now costs around 10% less than it did this time last year. But a sudden spike in oil prices could change everything. Dominic Kane for Counting the Cost in Berlin.
Joining us now from Paris, Neil Atkinson, an independent energy analyst and former head of the Oil Industry and Markets Division at the International Energy Agency. Good to have you with us, Neil. Why are markets, or why have been markets, so relaxed about escalating tension in the Middle East so far?
Well, I think it's because markets believe that there will not, in all likelihood, be a major disruption to global oil supplies of the type that you've just been discussing. There's too much at stake for everybody concerned. In the case of Iran, nearly all of its crude oil exports go to China. There are many other countries which are hugely dependent on oil supplies from the Middle East region as a whole. Japan gets almost all its crude oil from the Gulf. Korea gets most of its oil shipments from the Gulf. There's a great deal at stake. And quite frankly, if there were to be a significant interruption for any length of time, the disruption would be such that it could send oil prices soaring, even temporarily, which would have very, very negative impacts on the global economy. And politically, of course, as we mentioned earlier, there's the US presidential election coming along. If there were to be a very, very sharp, immediate spike in oil prices, that would feed through in time to the US gasoline consumer. And of course, if there were big price increases in the US, the Republicans would pile in on President Biden and Vice President Harris, blame them for it, and that would have political implications. So there's a great deal at stake for many, many people in ensuring that there is not the kind of escalation that we've been discussing.
And where does OPEC sit in all of this? It had delayed raising production until the end of the year. Will that still happen, do you think? And how disciplined is OPEC Plus? I mean, if there were shortages from the Middle East, if there were disruptions to supplies from the Middle East, would other oil producers step in and fill the gap?
Well, as far as OPEC Plus is concerned, it decided to delay production increases because before the most recent increase in Middle East tension, everybody was focusing on the fundamentals of the oil market, which are not as strong as we thought they would be earlier in the year. But if there were to be a major disruption to supplies, then yes, OPEC members by themselves are sitting on about 5 million barrels a day of spare production capacity, and there's about another 500,000 barrels a day amongst the countries that constitute the OPEC Plus alliance. And they would be ready, willing, and able to step in with more supplies if there was disruption. But of course, that assumes that the disruption does not include a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, because if the Strait of Hormuz is blockaded, there's nothing much that Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Kuwait, and Iraq can do to send out more supplies. But if there is disruption and those countries are able to supply more oil, they would be very happy to do so.
Of course, we're speaking before anything like this has happened, Neil. What are the risks here to global inflation? How high could the price of oil go, given the worst-case scenario, and for how long?
Well, of course, if there were to be a worst-case scenario, and we saw the cessation of 20 million barrels a day, let's take it at its most extreme, flowing through the Strait of Hormuz, then the immediate reaction, the price would almost certainly go through the roof. $100 would be a minimum. And frankly, where it could go and for how long is educated guesswork. But the loss of that amount of oil has never been seen before. But a factor that we should bear in mind here is that the United States Fifth Fleet has a big presence in the region, and the United States, and indeed others, would do everything they could in the short term to ensure that an international waterway is reopened as soon as possible. And let's not forget also that around the world, there are, again on paper, about 8 billion barrels of oil stocks held all around the world by various countries, whether they be controlled by companies or by governments. And again, on paper, that 8 billion barrels of oil stock equates to roughly 80 days or so of global oil demand. Now, in practice, you could not mobilize all 8 billion all at once, of course not, but it's to give an idea of the magnitude of oil stocks that do exist around the world and can be brought into play if necessary. And of course, the International Energy Agency has an emergency oil supply disruption program, which would bring into play the stocks that are held by IEA member countries, that's Western Europe, the United States, and Japan and Korea. So there is the possibility of some kind of action to ameliorate the worst impacts of a big disruption were it actually to happen.
Really good to talk to you again, Neil. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Now, China makes and owns more than half the world's electric vehicles. It's exporting those cars to the rest of the world at cheaper prices. Many countries want to curb Beijing's drive to dominate the market by imposing tariffs and restrictions. The latest, the European Union member states, who've decided to impose duties of up to 45% on China's EV imports. That's after an EU inquiry found China's state aid to its electric car makers gives them unfair leverage. But the move could spark a trade war between Brussels and Beijing, which has condemned the tariffs as protectionist. Fintan Monaghan reports.
China's electric vehicle business has been booming, but its push into global markets is facing major setbacks. The European Union is imposing heavy tariffs on Chinese EV imports. The bloc accuses China of subsidizing its industry, making their cars artificially cheap and giving them an unfair advantage.
We do not, and we never have wanted to, impose tariffs in this case for the sake of imposing tariffs. What we want is to remove the injurious subsidisation, the effect of the injurious subsidisation that our painstakingly detailed, WTO-compatible and thorough investigation identified.
The EU tariffs go as high as 45%. It follows moves by the US and Canada to impose 100% tariffs on Chinese EVs. China's Commerce Ministry has condemned these moves as unfair and unreasonable. It denies that subsidies have boosted its EV industries, saying well-developed supply chains are what's making them more competitive. China has launched investigations into a range of European exports, including meat, alcohol, and luxury cars. It's raising fears this may escalate into a larger trade war.
Of course, we fear countermeasures, and China is an important export market, so we are very concerned that this will lead to a larger conflict, which is bad for both sides.
There's also questions about how effective the EU's tariffs will be. Some firms making cars in China are already moving their production in order to get around it.
We have the plan and the discussion are ongoing to have a plant, a factory that will produce BEV in Europe, and it might also expand in the near future. So we are prepared, but this will take a few years to be put in place.
For now, Europe has become a less welcoming place for Chinese electric vehicles. But negotiations are ongoing, and officials on both sides say they hope some kind of compromise might still be reached. Fintan Monaghan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
So why are nations imposing tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles? Well, here's how the world's biggest producer hit trouble overseas and what its car makers are doing to try to get around it. China is the world's biggest producer of electric cars. It made 9 million of them last year. That's out of around 14 million new electric cars registered globally in 2023. This massive output allowed China to scale up and reduce costs. Production outpaced demand at home in recent years, so they've increasingly been looking to overseas markets. But these cheap imports have sparked a backlash. We mentioned tariffs from Europe and North America, but others are reacting too. Brazil increased theirs from 10% to 18% in July. And they have plans to hike this even further to 35% in July 2026. The effect of these tariffs has varied. In Brazil, there was a sharp drop in Chinese EV imports. In Canada, though, imports are still growing. And Chinese companies are taking steps to avoid trade barriers. Many are moving production overseas in order to avoid tariffs. Joining us now from Brisbane in Australia, Warwick Powell, Adjunct Professor at Queensland University of Technology and author of China, Trust and Digital Supply Chains, Dynamics of a Zero Trust World. Good to have you with us again, Warwick. What's the rationale behind imposing tariffs on Chinese EVs? And does that rationale differ between the US and the EU, for example?
The principal rationale officially is to protect incumbent industries where there are incumbent industries and provide them with breathing room and time to adjust to new technologies, new products and new competitors. However, I would venture to say that in the European case and also in the case of the United States, much of the moves, the defensive moves, have been driven by stronger geopolitical considerations rather than long-term economic considerations. The fact of the matter is that the EU Eurozone economy is facing severe headwinds, much of which has been brought about by energy shocks occasioned in the last few years. And the European Commission in particular, which has prosecuted the policies that have resulted in these sorts of energy shocks, is looking to apportion blame elsewhere. And unfortunately, pointing the finger at imports is an easy and a soft target. Desperate people will unfortunately do desperate things, which of course generate confusion and cause damage for many involved, but ultimately can cause more damage to those prosecuting the policies in the first place.
So as far as consumers in the US and the EU and elsewhere are concerned, will Chinese EVs remain competitive, or are they going to be priced out of the market by these tariffs?
Well, they certainly won't be priced out of the market. I mean, let's be frank. The average price of a Chinese EV manufactured in China is about half of the average price of an EV manufactured in the European Union, and Chinese EVs barely feature at all in the North American market, so they're not even there at the moment. The tariffs imposed at this stage by the European Commission, off the back, incidentally, of a minority of votes of member states, really would be inadequate in terms of dealing with the average price differentials. The other thing to bear in mind is that the product range of EVs from China is very extensive, from the lowest, cheapest entry-grade product, the BYD Seagull, for example, all the way through to some of the high-end luxury vehicles. And the tariffs imposed will no doubt have some effect on different consumer segments and buyer segments, who will adjust either by shifting down a price bracket to a lower cost vehicle, taking into account the tariffs, or perhaps defer some of their purchasing decisions. But consumers who are looking to purchase a new vehicle, whether they are households, enterprises, or fleet managers, will ultimately need to purchase vehicles that will deliver to them good value for money, and the Chinese manufactured products clearly offer good value for money.
What are the dangers here? Could there be a trade war between China and the EU, the US, the rest of the world?
The risk of these sorts of events is that they instigate or initiate the spiralling towards a tit-for-tat, which ultimately expands into a large-scale trade war. The opening up of trade over the past 30 years has actually delivered significant benefits to people all across the world, for both exporter and importer nations. Importer nations benefit by being able to access some of the best and best priced products from all over the world. And of course, by being competitive themselves, they're able to access new markets and generate revenues and export earnings for their own enterprises and ultimately create jobs locally. So trade is a two-way street. Many enterprises and, of course, households benefit from access to low-cost inputs and low-cost consumer products. And a trade war will actually undermine many of these supply chains and enterprises and ultimately create unanticipated or unintended adverse outcomes. This would be a devastating outcome should there be a trade war right across the board. No one wins from trade wars.
And what about EU car makers? Now, EU states some of them had their doubts, their concerns about imposing tariffs EU-wide on Chinese EVs. Do these tariffs help EU car producers as well, or hinder EU car producers too?
The risk for EU car producers, particularly those with significant manufacturing facilities in China, is that they'll get caught up in all of this, number one. And number two, of course, there could be a backlash, which will impact EU exports to China, or even if there is not an official regulated backlash, could generate a consumer backlash, which would diminish even further consumer acceptance of European manufactured products. And again, these are the unintended consequences of initiating policy actions based on very, very narrow and, dare I say, hysterical considerations.
Really good to talk to you, Warwick. Many thanks indeed for being with us.
Great to be with you.
Now, after decades of solid growth, Thailand's economy has faltered. It's lagging behind its peers in Southeast Asia, who've bounced back strongly after the COVID-19 pandemic. A decline in exports, manufacturing production and private investment has dragged down the Thai economy. The government now wants to improve the economic outlook by encouraging Thai people to spend more, among other measures. It plans to do that by handing them money in so-called digital wallets. Well, the first phase of that stimulus scheme got underway last week. It includes payments of more than $280 to 45 million citizens and is estimated to cost the Thai government more than $14 billion. The scheme was a major campaign promise from the Pheu Thai party ahead of Thailand's general elections last year. But critics of the measure say that it's fiscally irresponsible. Joining us now from Bangkok is Paul Crosio, a partner at Silk Legal and former investment banker and economist. Good to have you with us, Paul. How does issuing a digital wallet loaded with money, which is essentially free money from the state, help move the Thai economy?
Well, the short answer is that it does inject capital into the market. There will be an uptick in consumer spending. For people who receive this as basically a windfall. But long-term, it doesn't address the systemic issues, which are slowing down the growth of the Thai economy and have been doing so probably pre-COVID era as well. So short-term, there will be some uptick. Long-term, it's not the solution that people were looking for.
So what's ailing Thailand's economy right now? What are the challenges?
Well, the challenges are firstly, from the political point of view, there's definitely a feeling that the government is transitional. Whether it is or not is wait to be seen, but we've had an elected government that didn't and wasn't able to form a government now being disbanded. We've had a coalition government, the Prime Minister being ousted under a court judgment, and now we have a government which is a new alliance of parties, some of which have been antagonists for decades. So we've got a political issue. We've also got the issue that the Thai economy itself is heavily reliant on tourism. And we know that tourism didn't bounce back as quickly as people expected after COVID for various reasons. And also there seems to be a plateauing of tourism as well. The tourists that are coming here are seeing are a different type of tourists. They are lower spending tourists. So the country has been going after a quantity approach in tourism, which puts stress on the resources and the beauty that was one of the draw cards of tourism previously.
So what, Paul, does Thailand need to do to fix all of this, to get its economy back on track?
Sure. Well, I think it needs to realize that there are no short-term solutions to this. The solutions, which is to improve infrastructure, to improve the education system, are all long-term. It also needs to open up the country and reduce bureaucracy. One of the things that we hear day to day is the difficulties of setting up businesses and complying with government bureaucracy in Thailand as well. So that's another issue that needs to be addressed. And the other thing that Thailand needs to do is progress from a country where it was a low-cost labor base to a country providing services. And in that sense, it's competing with major economies such as Singapore and Malaysia for a position within the global supply chain, and is having to differentiate itself from its neighbors such as the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam, which at the present time offer a lower cost manufacturing base.
Good to talk to you, Paul. Thanks for being with us on Counting the Cost.
Thank you so much. Goodbye.
Ethiopia has faced huge challenges in recent years, including a civil war that ended in late 2022. Now, while internal security remains a top issue for the government, it also wants to improve the livability of its capital, which is home to about 6 million people. But, as journalist Jim Stenman reports now from Addis Ababa, that comes with complications.
It's moving in day for Mesvin Abul. After a life filled with challenges, his family has been given a new home by the Ethiopian government.
Because of the pressure of living with so many people in such a small space, some of us had no choice but to leave the family home and rent elsewhere.
The father of three now lives in one of nearly 400 apartments on the very same site they used to house their previous tiny family home. It's part of a social housing project built using a prefabricated model and could benefit more than 1,000 people.
This technology gives us a room to finalize a floor, maximum 7 days.
This approach has helped complete each building in roughly 3 months, a promising model for Africa's second most populous country, where demand for affordable housing is immense. Habitat for Humanity estimates that 7 out of every 10 homes in the country needs to be replaced, and many of these lack access even to basic sanitation.
Despite facing significant economic challenges in recent years, including inflation and foreign debt, Ethiopia's government is focused on urban redevelopment, believing that it is key to unlocking the country's future prosperity. But with change comes friction.
Not everyone gets to benefit from this new social housing, with squatters unable to take part. In a speech earlier this year, Addis Abeba's mayor acknowledged that more than 10,000 residents had been relocated from in and around one of the city's most historic areas as part of other regeneration. And some say decisions like this demand difficult conversations.
It is a painful process. Unfortunately, with some of these developments, it tends to sort of break down these social fabrics. And then the livelihood also associated with these smaller, old neighborhoods.
Still, the Prime Minister's office views this social housing project as a blueprint for improving living standards in other parts of the country.
Change is difficult, inevitably. But then a short 3-4 months later, the same people who had been removed from here have been given a dignified way of living.
Though Mesvin and his family are among the lucky ones, these quarters next to his house serve as a reminder of how they used to live, and as many Ethiopians still do. A far cry from his new home where his children can play and build a better future. Jim Stenneman, Al Jazeera, Addis Ababa.
And that's our show for this week. If you'd like to comment on anything that you've seen, I'm at A. Finnegan on X. Try to remember to use the hashtag AJCTC. You could also drop us a line. Counting the cost at aljazeera.net is our email address. As always, there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC. That takes you straight to our page. There you'll find individual reports, links, and entire editions for you to catch up on. But that's it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Adrian Finnegan from the team here in Doha. Thanks for being with us. The news is next.